Okay, here we go with this one. Now, this is going to be, if I could pull it up here. Everything's real slow today on the computer. Okay, now let me just check here. All right, this is going to involve a discussion of time. And I do not concede the, let me just check this. I do not concede the existence of time as an actuality, and nor do I concede the existence of space as an actuality. I believe time and space, like color and up and down and speed and all those kinds of things, are concepts that human beings use to organize the relative movement of objects they observe in the environment. And my primary argument for disagreeing with the actuality and causal properties of time has to do with the fact that you cannot observe time absent objects, meaning if you take the physical material objects out of the equation, then time has no meaning. It can't be observed. It has no truth. It has no relevancy. Time is always seen as a function of objects in the environment. It is never seen outside of them. So to make an argument that time exists and has causal property is like saying the tooth fairy exists and has causal property. I know that's a stretch and that's probably offensive to people, but since time is never observed, it's not even a function so much as observed. It isn't observed outside of objects. So to say that objects are a function of time rather than time is a function of objects, I think is pretty irrational. But it's not even it's not so much you can't observe time. I mean, there certainly is that, the fact that time is always spoken of in tandem with a specific material object. It's also the fact that time as a causal force in and of itself isn't really relevant, isn't really rational, because time has to be infinite, and it's not only it has to be infinite in order for it to be a useful concept, but even just looking at how science describes the origins of time are completely inconsistent, completely contradictory. And this is what this article is going to deal with, the idea that time somehow exists as a causal force which can actually be quantified itself. And one of the ways I do this is I sort of examine the young Earth argument and the old Earth argument. For those of you who aren't familiar, the young Earth creationist movement is a movement by primarily neo-Calvinist Christians, neo-Reformation Christians, who are really pushing old-school Calvinism, which is extremely Gnostic and heavily rooted in Platonist philosophy. It's extremely deterministic and it's totally irrational. But it's been getting some traction because of the way the Bible is proof-texted by the proponents of young Earth. They make a compelling argument, I guess, to certain people who may not be as informed as they should be about what I would consider to be the metaphorical nature of Genesis. I mean, to sit there and say that the entire Bible has to be taken literally is silly on its face. A cursory reading of the Bible and Psalms and the Song of Solomon, just to mention two examples, is again, elementary evidence that it's not to be taken literally. That there are certain poetic and metaphorical aspects to the Bible that are just glaringly obvious. And again, I would consider Genesis to be that, which puts me in category of heretic for most Orthodox Christians, but as they have yet to really present a rational argument for why Genesis could not be metaphorical, I'm not really too worried. And one of the things is the whole young Earth argument. Now, scientists sort of rightly go after young Earth creationists because it's pretty nonsensical if we accept that if we accept the common definitions of time. If you accept the common definition of time and then you apply it to the things like speed of light and the expansion of the universe and the distance of stars, then it's pretty clear that the Earth would be old. But because I don't consider time actual, because I consider time to be an abstraction, basically a concept, I like to use the argument that both young Earth and old Earth proponents are probably wrong, because since time is not actual, age is not actual. So the Earth isn't really an age, and the universe isn't really an age. An age is a concept we apply to what we observe in order to organize it as one of the ways we organize it, along with other concepts, like I've said, up and down and left and right, and color and taste and flavor and weight and gravity and all that kind of stuff. And I've often told young Earth creationists that if they wanted to win the argument, all they really have to do is deny the common and popular definitions of time. They can just, because time is a concept, it's relative, they can just sort of redefine it. And voila, old Earth becomes young Earth. If we take young Earth, if we take a million years and make them 1 year, then, why not? We can take 10 minutes and make 10 minutes 10 seconds. It's completely relative. So if they just deny the definitions of time and just sort of reapply a different quantification to it, then they can, all of a sudden, it's young Earth relative to what the old Earth would agree. You can say, well, according to us, we say the Earth is only 10,000 years old because a year to us would be a million years to you, and who's to say who's right? And we're going to change the definition of young and old. Now young is going to be 10,000 young Earth years. That's going to be young, and old will be a million young Earth years. So I know that seems absurd on its face, but the point is that since time is really a concept and is totally relative, the way you win an argument against old Earth scientists is just deny their definition of time. It's silly and stupid in a sense, but it kind of illustrates that it's the argument's not necessarily about the age of the Earth. The argument is about how we want to cooperate as human beings, how we want to define these concepts. So I basically have called this article or essay "Leaping Old Earth and Young Earth Arguments in a Single Bound. The Fallacy is Rooted in the False Presumptions." And it starts like this. If time and space were created at the Big Bang, then it would be impossible to assign a where and a when to that event, right? Therefore, how do you define its beginning? You can't really say it happened however many billions of years ago, because by definition there can be no when, and by extension no where, to its beginning, since time and space didn't exist until after the Big Bang. And most physicists agree time and space occurred after the Big Bang. So my point is that if time occurred after the Big Bang, then the Big Bang occurred when? It occurred no when. It didn't occur at any time, so it's pretty hard to say how old the universe is when you don't have a beginning time. If I say I'm 5 years old, but my birth date happened on 000, the day 0, the month 0, and the year 0, how can you really gauge how old I am, since the reference point is 0, is nothing? And the same thing about space. If space doesn't occur until after the Big Bang, then where did the Big Bang occur? It occurred nowhere. It occurred in itself. So it's pretty hard to say that the universe is expanding, like science says, because expanding from where? If I say I'm going to the store, but I say I'm starting from nowhere, you can't really tell me how far it is to the I can't really tell you, and you can't really tell me how far it is to the store. If I start at no location, then the distance to the store is infinite, 0, irrelevant, undefinable. So the problems with time and space as being actualities and applying them to the age of the universe and therefore the age of the things in the universe, the size of the universe and the expansion of the universe is it's pretty basic logic. The logic just doesn't hold up. So that's why I find it fascinating that scientists want to be philosophers and they want to answer the question of everything. And Stephen Hawking says, science puts religion out of business. Religion is fundamentally philosophical, right? So if the religion can be shown to be philosophically sound, then really there's nothing science can do to dismantle it as madness. I would concede that or submit that Christianity, when it's removed from its Platonist Gnostic roots, is highly rational. And I really don't worry too much about Stephen Hawking's sort of dismantling my faith, because he can't even answer the question. He can't even reconcile the idea that the universe can't be expanding and yet start from nowhere. He can't seem to reconcile the idea that if the Big Bang starts at zero location, it can't really be expanding by definition. This is not rocket science, and that's probably why he isn't very good at philosophy. He's much better at rocket science, probably, and he should probably stick to that. Rocket scientists should probably stick to rocket science, and the philosophers will deal with truth. So, anyway, so therefore, how do you define its beginning? Okay, let's start over again. If time and space were created at the Big Bang, then it would be impossible to assign a where and a when to that event, right? Therefore, how do you define its beginning? You can't really say it happened however many billions of years ago, because, by definition, there can be no when, and by extension no where, to its beginning, since time and space didn't exist until after the Big Bang. And so it's impossible to tell ultimately, then, how old the universe is. Indeed, you cannot even say it had a beginning, because something that is absent of time or place cannot be said to have a beginning. And this is why I argue that the universe is. Everything is where it is, and it's as old as it is. Meaning everything is what it is. Its age is itself. Its space is itself. The quantification of time and space, the quantification of location and age, only become rational when they are relative to another object. And again, this is pretty basic stuff. I mean, this is not difficult logic. And yet, you know, everywhere you go, the concession is that time and space are actual. Time and space bends. Time and space is warped. Time and space can't really exist, and if they did, they'd be infinite, which means we couldn't really observe it anyway, and you couldn't quantify it. So how does something infinite warp into itself? It just doesn't comport. It doesn't compute. But anyway, so I suspect it won't be the last time this question will go unanswered. Physicists are extremely reticent to admit the Platonism inherent in their science, because at the end of it all, it's a great big fat shrug. At the core of science, I've come to realize, at least as it pertains to the foundational mathematics, is nothing more than Gnosticism in quantifiable form. And this is to say that this is the scientific definition of truth, that what cannot be proven because it cannot be shown to be actual, like numbers and constants and laws which govern, because it cannot be observed. And again, it's more than just it can't be observed. It can't be rationalized as a separate entity. There's no rational explanation. It has no relevancy. So even if it could be, if you observe something, it has to be relevant. You can't observe. So I guess even if you could observe time and space, it wouldn't be relevant because it would be infinite. So it wouldn't have any relevancy in and of itself. It's only relevant when objects are introduced. So anyway, sorry, the computer hiccuped here. It's only relevant when you introduce objects. So objects are the thing that give time and space meaning, which means time and space can be purely conceptual, and they don't have to be actual. All we have to have is objects moving relative to one another. So, and this is heady, and that's a little bit more of an involved argument, and that's something I hope to touch upon in later videos. And this is to say that this is the scientific definition of truth, that what cannot be proven because it cannot be shown to be actual, like numbers and constants and laws which govern, because it cannot be observed, is really the cause of all that exists. And for the experimental physicist, this must be doubly frustrating. I mean, as those who claim that empirical evidence is the evidence of choice for truth, it must be awfully hard to acknowledge that at the root of the presumption is that what cannot be actually observed is the objective standard for how we gauge the veracity of our empirical, that is, observed evidence. In other words, we prove observational evidence as a direct function of what cannot at all be observed, which is, of course, how the math reconciles. Math is nothing more than the abstract quantification of the action of an object or objects after it has already happened. It seems a little too convenient to me to be the gold standard for truth. You set your constants by the actions of objects you can only observe after the fact, and then you claim laws which govern, which implies coming before. And so what you are trying to get past the logical smell test is to declare that all which is said to govern is a direct function of purely object-derived actions, which I submit can never be rationally proven to have been caused by these laws at all, because you can never observe a law before it acts upon an object. Again, let me say that again. You can never observe a law of physics before it acts upon an object, only after the fact. So it can't be a governing law. It can be a mathematical law but it is something you invent. It is something which describes, not governs. There's a huge difference between describing how something moves and saying that this thing governs the way something moves. A huge philosophical, epistemological difference. Massive, with massive implications. One way it's descriptive. The other way one way it's descriptive and helpful to man to organize an environment. The other way it's completely determinative and destroys man and removes him from the entire existential equation altogether. Because you can never observe a law before it acts upon an object, which means that all you can possibly know, unless you are declaring some kind of mystic revelation or divine insight, is that objects act first, which means all actions are a direct function of the object's ability to act, which means that the object, not the math or the law, is the source of its being. Does this not raise the eyebrows of a single rational soul? How can we claim truth when by our very standards we can never actually see it? I see a contradiction in terms on the road ahead. It isn't then curious why the experimental physicist on a particular blog that I go to, he saw the road and turned around. Meaning, I was debating a physicist on time, and he saw the contradiction. He saw his own contradiction in terms, and bailed on the conversation. Which is generally what happens. They usually people who consider themselves to be the wizards of smart in some area, when they're sort of confronted with their own contradictions, they tend to leave the conversation. They sort of accept the cognitive dissonance as a function of their sort of superior intellect. And since you can't really understand them, you must be the one who's an idiot. So generally they sort of stop the discussion. That happens pretty much all the time. I have yet to have any kind of a discussion with a physicist, and I know several, about these kinds of issues, about the causal properties of laws and the actuality of time and space. That actually, I've yet to have a conversation that really finishes or terminates. They generally sort of leave the conversation. And this is because they're really not equipped to handle the contradiction, because they're scientists, they're not philosophers, and they're inherently Platonists. So the philosophical assumptions are already set in stone. So they already have a philosophy set in stone. And the Platonism implied in the inherent Platonism in science is generally assumed to be sort of a constant. And so when you question the constant assumptions behind science's truths or proofs, they tend to their minds tend to sort of go tilt, and they don't really have anything left to say, or don't. In a sense, I believe it's the sort of endemic arrogance in science, and I don't mean they're all arrogant, but I think there's an arrogance that the very definition of intellectual and intellect and IQ, high IQ, is somebody who's good in mathematics and to some extent computers and things like that. And so instead of sort of admitting their own contradictions in terms and conceding the argument, they would rather just kind of end it. So okay, so then having said all of that, it seems to me that the problem with young Earth creationism as touted by the Gnostic mystics of pseudo-Christianity and old Earth creationism as touted by the Gnostic mystics of pseudo-empiricism, of pseudo-empiricist standards, is the exact same problem, the impossibility of actually defining the terms old and young. For if time is purely relative, and it is nothing more than an abstraction, which is derivative of man's ability to cognitively abstract concepts, which it is, then it's impossible to declare that old is actually old or that young is actually young, because there's no actual reference point. For by definition, time is nothing more than a quantification of the relative movement between two or more objects, a different conceptual idea of movement as opposed to distance or length or even gravity. So the problem then is that there is no other actual reference, but only a man-contrived abstract reference by which to gauge the time of the universe in order that the universe may be determined to be either young or old. Since the beginning of creation is a singularity, then what is the other reference point by which we measure its time? There is no y to creation's x, no b to creation's a. How do you have a measurement of any temporal kind unless you know the start time? That is, you cannot have an age unless you know when whatever it is you are temporally defining began. If there is no wind to its beginning, then it cannot have an age. And what I'm submitting is that since creation had a beginning literally in a vacuum, according to both young and old earthers, as well as agnostic or atheist scientists, it is categorically impossible to declare when creation began. And if you cannot know when creation began, further compounded by the fact that it is often said without any sense of irony by either young Earth or old Earth advocates that space and time were likewise created in the beginning, which has a temporal value of 0, making time a direct function of no time. So again, if you cannot know when creation began, then it is by definition impossible to say just how old or young creation actually is. And further, how do you have a beginning from nothing at all? How does nothing, because both camps assume that God made creation from nothing, and when I say both camps, I mean old Earth Christians and new young Earth Christians. So how does nothing spawn a thing which does not exist? What value can be given to creation if the material from which it sprang forth is 0? And again, Christians assume, and this is their own serious, fundamental doctrinal and philosophical flaw. They assume God made, it's called ex nihilo, the creation of something from nothing, which is a contradiction in terms and therefore impossible by definition. But Christians, both Old Earth and Young Earth, no matter what denomination, Catholic or Protestant, Greek Orthodox, Russian Orthodox, Eastern Orthodox, they all concede ex nihilo, as far as I'm aware. So God creating something from nothing. That's just not possible, because in order for nothing to be nothing, it can't be something. And nothing cannot give birth to something by definition. Nothing and something are mutually exclusive concepts. So how does nothing spawn a thing which does not exist? What value can be given to creation if the material from which it sprang forth is 0? Anything derived from 0 is 0. Even the mathematicians have to give me that one. That's just common mathematical sense. A 4-year-old knows that if you start with 0 bananas and add a banana, you haven't added 1 banana to 0, you have merely replaced the empty spot on the table with a banana. You can add another banana to get 2 bananas, but you can't add 1 of anything to nothing, to no banana, to the absence of banana, to make that nothing become 1 banana, because the absence of banana is understandably infinite. The absence of banana cannot become, by definition, banana. Absence of banana and banana are mutually exclusive concepts. And the same is true for the universe. The absence of anything cannot produce something by definition, because then it becomes a contradiction in terms. The absence of universe cannot ever be created into universe without utterly destroying the concept of nothing. And if that is destroyed, then so is the idea that God is first cause, because God could not have created something from nothing if it did not exist, except that in order for nothing to exist, for nothing to remain truly nothing, then something, by definition, could never have been derived from it. It is a logical sinkhole from which there is no escape no matter how hard one tries. It is not possible. In the end, if you concede nothing, then you cannot claim that anything can be created out of it. It just doesn't work at all. But getting back to the notion of time. As I was saying, you simply cannot determine old or young if you cannot define when the when of creation start. And it doesn't matter that the physicist or old Earth creationists speak of events happening 10 seconds after the Big Bang or 1 minute after the Big Bang. If you cannot say when the Big Bang was, or where by extension, then you cannot define what in the hell 10 seconds or 1 minute actually is. 10 seconds from what is my wholly rational question. 10 seconds after the Big Bang, yes, but when was the Big Bang? We cannot say because our reference time and place for the Big Bang is nothing, or at best is merely the Big Bang. The Big Bang is the beginning. So how do you know 10 seconds passed if there's no start time? If the start time is the Big Bang, well, that's not a time. 10 seconds then is merely arbitrary. There was no way to prove that 10 seconds is actually 10 seconds. The Big Bang didn't have a time. It was beginning. Yes, but how do you define beginning? Big Bang. How do you define time? Big Bang. What is 10 seconds? Big Bang. Then how can we know that 10 seconds is 10 seconds if it's impossible to make a distinction between the passage of time and the thing from which it sprang? I tell you, readers, this is Looney Tunes, and this is my blog. And the same argument can be used on the intelligent design folks. God created the heavens and the earth in 6 days. 6 days from when? From when he started. Yes, but when was that? What time did he start? When he did. He didn't start at a time. He created time. So time had a beginning after God began to create. Okay, I'll make it easy on you. Just tell me then when God created time. Because it doesn't say in the Bible that God created time. It doesn't say in the Bible God creates time. It says in 6 days God created the heavens and the earth. But it doesn't say he created time. See? I think Genesis is metaphorical. God didn't create time. It never. This is where people think the Bible's irrational. Well, God created time, and so time is a determinative function of God, and therefore time is really, we're all determined because God controls time. No. Nowhere in the Bible does it say God created time. It doesn't say that. It doesn't even imply that. You may think it implies it, but it doesn't. People who lump Christianity in, specifically Judaism, the Old Testament, with other mystical forms of hierarchical caste systems like Hinduism or Islam. I'm not a pastor. I'm not here touting religion. It's really, reason is my thing. But, I think they kind of accept or concede these ideas that the Bible says things that it doesn't really say. They sort of believe these Christians that say, well, the Bible speaks about man's total depravity. It doesn't. The Bible speaks of man being fallen. It doesn't. The Bible speaks of man's original sin. It doesn't. You will find in the Bible nowhere the words totally depraved. You will nowhere find the words original sin. You will nowhere find the words man has fallen or man is fallen. Anywhere. Man is never described as fallen. He's never described as having original sin. Anywhere in the Bible. So I think if atheists want to continue to attack Christianity for being an irrational religion, they really need to study a little bit more to see if what they're being told about Christianity is actually true or not. So time at a beginning after God began to create. Okay, I'll make it easy on you. Just tell me when God created time, because it doesn't say in the Bible that God created time. That is, how soon after he began to create did he make time? Was it a minute after he began creating? An hour after he began creating? He began it when he began it. So the time he created time is indefinite. Yes, because he just did. Okay, when was it finished being created? How long did it take God to create time? I'm not sure. Let's say an hour. So an hour beginning at indefinite time? Sure. Do you not see how that's completely contradictory and logically insane? How can you start to count 60 minutes? How can you start to count 60 minutes beginning with an indefinite moment? If the beginning moment itself is completely excluded from the time construct, then how can it possibly be the beginning of a 60-minute cycle of time? Because I can make the time anything I want. It's a matter of biblical truth. Time is real because it's in the Bible. No, the Bible says nothing about God creating time because that would not make a damn bit of sense. Next question. So let me get this straight. Time has no time of its beginning, and therefore creation itself has no time of its beginning. Then how can you show that 6 days is actually 6 days? If a day has no beginning, because beginning must be a function of time, then how can you measure it out to say that a day is shown to be an actual day? 24 hours from no time cannot possibly be shown to be 24 hours. Unless you concede that time is merely an arbitrary abstraction devised by man as a means of organizing his observable environment. Do you concede? No, because 6 days is in the Bible and the Bible is infallible. Yes, readers, feel free to scream now. I know I want to. And so this is the insurmountable problem. Young and old are predicated on the idea of a beginning time which cannot ever be provided. Since time was either created with the rest of creation or was created out of nothing, giving the start time as zero, as nothing, then there can be by definition no actual beginning to creation. And if you can't say when it began, it's impossible to declare how old or young the universe is. So that's that, and I hope that clears some things up for people, or at least causes you to begin to question some of your assumptions and to begin to question the existence of some things you were told are real and actual. And I appreciate you watching this video. Thank you very much, and you guys have a great day.